Hey, I'm Mel.
And I'm Andres, and you're listening to
Mixtape, your favorite Afro-Latin podcast.
What she said.
In Puerto Rico, back in 2019, the people marched and protested for like 15, 16 days in the summer and ousted our governor, first governor that the people have ousted in Puerto Rico through protest, which was historic. I don't want to say that reggaeton was the thing that ousted the governor, but I think it certainly helped in many ways.
Today's single presents the extended version of our interview with Dr. Beth Colón Pizzini. Beth is an assistant professor of instruction at the University of Texas at Austin in the African and African Diaspora Studies Department. Her expertise is on Puerto Rico's music and street art, Puerto Rican, Caribbean, and Afro-diasporic feminism, Pan-Caribbean and Afro-diasporic cultural and political exchanges, and decolonial practices. This interview with Beth is part of the investigative work for track 8 of our second season, Cuando Baila Reggaetón, while Dancing Reggaetón. Check it out, it's good stuff.
Today's single title is inspired by the song Quítate tú pa ponerme yo of the game-changing album 12 Discípulos. We chose this song because it represents a pivotal moment in the history of reggaeton, bringing together many heavyweights of the genre. This song is part of Beth's reggaeton playlist, Formative Perreo. Check it out on Spotify, it's really good. Finally, we really like this title because, as Mel says, it describes part of what our mission is in the podcast. Quítate tú pa ponerme yo means move aside so that I can take place. It captures our intention to remove the narrative that centers whiteness in the music and culture that sprouted from black roots and contributions. Quítate tú pa ponerme yo, we say. We was there to begin with anyways.
My name is Dr. Beth Colón Pizzini. I was born and raised in Puerto Rico. I am currently an assistant professor of instruction at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm also a cultural writer and critic, a burgeoning one, so to speak, really interested in making connections between culture and society that are much more in terms of like public knowledge, that it doesn't stay in the academy. That's very important to me. I got my MA PhD from UT Austin, the department that I'm currently teaching in, the African and African Diaspora Studies Department. I got my BA in Political Science and Latino Studies from Northwestern University up in Evanston, Illinois. And so my sort of academic journey has always been about culture, the politics of culture, the relationship between capital P politics and culture. And so that's what I try to bring into my scholarship and my writing and just my general interests. My journey into reggaeton was just growing up with it. I was born in 1992, full disclosure. And so I was there when it was sort of becoming not only something that was known within a larger Puerto Rican context, but also globalizing and having this first global boom in the mid 2000s that took the genre to something that nobody really expected, not even the people that were creating it or rapping and really entrenched within making that music or even consuming that music. So in terms of that and my knowledge and my interest in it, it's really because it was all around me as I was growing up. And, I grew up dancing to it from middle school into high school and college. It's something that I still, think of as something very important, but also culturally impactful and resistive and just incredible. And so I try to make it part of not only my own personal, journey through life, but also talk about it more and give the respect that it's due within culture writing and scholarly writing, because reggaeton is culture. It was part of my culture. So yeah.
For those of us unfamiliar with the development of reggaeton, tell us where it began.
Firstly, what's very important to understand is that reggaeton in its development and at its core is, despite its waves of globalization that have brought upon a whitening of the genre, which we can talk about a little bit later, it's an Afro-diasporic rhythm and a Pan-Caribbean rhythm. And there's a lot of overlap between these two terms, of course. So throughout its almost 40-year existence by now, and its evolution, you could hear elements that are shared with US hip hop, salsa, merengue, Jamaican dancehall and reggae, Colombian cumbia, Trinidadian soca, Haitian compa, calypso, bomba. All of these Afro-diasporic genres have come together within reggaeton in varying degrees throughout its history. And it's something that, Wayne Marshall refers to it as the ultimate sonic amalgamation of Western Blackness. And so it's also important to then recognize that this amalgamation is happening, or had been happening, and even to this day, happening within simultaneity and throughout time and space. So I'll start with time and space and place and all of that. And of course, you can't have reggaeton as we know it without Jamaican dancehall and reggae. And it could not have become a Spanish language companion to those genres if it wasn't for Jamaican migration to Panama to labor not only in the construction of the canal that the US was building to compete with these larger European colonial powers at that time, but also their descendants and the more contemporary waves of Jamaican migration to Panama to work the free trade zones and ports along the canal. So Jamaica and Panama are particularly important stops along the sonic train of this genre. So, I like to sometimes think, could a Puerto Rican or even a Dominican have encountered this music in these places or in the highly diasporic United States and, made something of this music and make it something in Spanish, very Caribbean, very theirs, maybe, but that's not necessarily how it happened. It could not have been a genre that we know without this stop from Jamaica to Panama. And then from Panama, you have migrants, from the 80s and 90s, like El General, for example, who land in New York and try to make something of this music, try to find a larger opportunity with this music that they are, very proud of and that they are really experts in. And so that's where you find the connection much more directly with other Caribbean folk in city spaces like in New York. You have Puerto Ricans and Dominicans and even Cubans coming together with Jamaicans and Panamanians and other people of African descent to, not only be part of a youth culture that is burgeoning at that point, which includes hip hop, of course, because they were also involved in the creation of hip hop, but also something in their mother tongue, so to speak, in a more, Caribbeanized version of reggae that is already Caribbean, but it's giving a different twist to it. And so from there, because, Puerto Ricans and Dominicans of the 80s and 90s are going through this incredible change of massive globalization. The internet is, now going to become this incredibly important tool that connects the whole world. That along with travel and migration, Puerto Ricans in particular, because we've had US citizenship since 1917, the traveling is made easier. So there's this sort of cycle of va-y-ven, as we call it, of like coming and going from New York or Hartford or Orlando or wherever, that is also then matched with a very Puerto Rican experience. So these youths were having, one foot in the United States and one foot in Puerto Rico, or having connections in some way. Their cousins were doing that type of migration and they brought certain music with them or certain practices and traditions. And then, so they were having this involvement within this culture, within both places, all at once. That's what I mean by simultaneity, this, travel and this migration throughout the 1900s and into the 2000s of Caribbean people makes this a very diasporic and admixed genre as we know it. And so that's why, it's a very, in terms of the spread, and which I think we'll talk about later on, you have not only the ease of travel and the sharing of this music with the internet, in particular in the 2000s, but even the infrastructure of touring gets better. These artists are becoming more known, their music is becoming more entrenched. And as they tour and perform more in other countries, that also spreads the popularity and knowledge of the genre. And so it's to the point that now you can hear reggaeton anywhere and everywhere. And you have artists that are not from the backgrounds found in, the roots of the genre, Colombia, Argentina, Chile, Mexico, Spain, participating and even becoming stars across the globe. But we can talk about that a little bit later.
Muchos me miran como si yo fuera un tipo sin arreglo, como si nunca antes hubieran visto un negro, como si fuera un delincuente, como si con el lápiz y con mi libreta yo matara gente.
Tell us more about the widening process that reggaeton has undertaken.
Yeah, so that sort of becomes, once again, a very particular process that happens in simultaneity. So there is, within the Puerto Rican context, when it comes to whitening the genre, the entrenchment of the government and the sort of policing and demonization and basically pathologizing of the people that create this genre within Puerto Rico, that is then also used in other countries as well, in Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Mexico, all of these places that have found, that reggaeton has sort of found a home or a popularity. The powers that be, so to speak, find a way to attack because of, racist policies or racist understandings of their own nationhood and who their people are. And so that was one of the ways in which the sort of negativity that came, or the negative reaction that came with reggaeton, as more white or white passing stars became involved, it sort of became easier for these people to accept it. There was also the fact that this genre, as it became more popular, needed to find itself within radio play and public performances and TV award shows. And you can't perform songs necessarily if there are sexually explicit lyrics or, bad words and all of that kind of stuff. So the artists themselves had to self-censor a lot of the times what they were rapping about and singing about and the words that they were choosing to express that. And there's also the fact that in terms of, capitalism. Once this genre becomes very popular, American markets, American labels become interested, whether it's a fad or whether it's not. They want a piece of the pie because they see that it's very popular in these markets that they could tap into and extract money from, whether it be in Latin America and the Caribbean itself, or within Latinx communities in the United States. So there's all of these things happening, across the Spanish-speaking world that affects the whitening of reggaeton, or that enables the whitening of reggaeton, that then becomes almost best practice in order for producers and artists and managers and labels to find some type of success, because gatekeeping Black people from the genre means that they can sort of control the product a little bit better, they can control the image of the genre a little bit better, and they can, of course, still work within these logics of white supremacy that is very global, and extract more money from that because, it's more desirable, it's more palatable, they're not being too offensive. And so you have all of that happening at the same time. And even within, the larger Puerto Rican context, these steps are happening at the very same time. Like I said, you have a larger sort of moment in which reggaeton is transforming itself, that is being affected by our government, by religious institutions, by elite culture, at the same time that it's, having encounters with other global markets and other global players.
You mentioned a number of efforts to censor reggaeton. What was so dangerous about this rhythm?
So, you have to keep in mind that in its earliest expressions in the late 1980s and even early 1990s, in Puerto Rico in particular, and in other places that were doing reggaeton or reggae en español or even rap en español, this was a musical tool to communicate the reality experienced by those of the working class, of the underemployed class, the majority of whom are of African descent. And so they were highly persecuted, policed, and criminalized within Latin American and Caribbean societies. And within Puerto Rico, the earliest iteration of this music was also just being produced, written, and performed by working class youth in their teens and their 20s. So it was also almost like a generational war as well. And, this transformation of the culture that these older, mostly white elites were seeing. And they were very worried because these youth were talking about, not just sex and young people things, but they were also critiquing the over-policing of their communities. They were critiquing the stratification of class and the geographies and how the geographies matched that stratification, especially in the Puerto Rican context, where you have, wealthier communities also sometimes side by side with public housing projects, for example, as the suburbanization of Puerto Rico was following the suburbanization of the United States in the 50s and 60s. So there was this hope that by having this close proximity within these two classes that were sometimes very much so racialized differently, that they would, the rich people would be teaching the impoverished people how to, pull themselves up by their bootstraps, work hard, and these mores of middle class and upper class Puerto Ricanness. And that project kind of failed, very much so, to the point that by the time that we get to the 80s and the 90s, where this music is really being created and spread throughout these, more impoverished and exploited communities, the rich people start gating themselves off from these other communities. So not only do they gate themselves off, they also put gates around these communities themselves, especially the public housing projects, because there was a racial panic, there was a moral panic about crime, there was a moral panic about, even looser sexual mores at the time. And so they don't want to interact with that. They don't want to see the way that the youth of their country are very different from them, and that is threatening to them. And so we have this moment in which the government is raiding, back when CDs were sold and there were establishments for that, they're raiding these, music selling establishments. They are raiding music video producers, their archives, essentially, of all the music videos that they have been recording with these new artists. They are raiding parties and clubs that are playing this music. There's this incessant need to stop crime at the time. And that means that you then have to over-police youth, because through their music, through their Blackness, through their lower class status, they are already then pathologized as criminal to these elites. And so we see this rise in physical violence and policing from the state at the same time that you have these leaders, both secular government leaders, but also religious leaders in Puerto Rico specifically, trying to use very hateful rhetoric to help make sure that Puerto Rican culture and youth are being essentially fixed, that they're not being fully corrupted, that we can turn the course around to basically destroy this burgeoning genre and culture. But they failed, obviously. And it ended up being a thing that once they become very vocal about it, it provides, first of all, even more desire of people to listen to this music and to dance to this music and go to their parties, but also to promote the artists themselves. Ivy Queen famously in 2006 was like, Senator Velda Gonzalez, who was one of these very vocal anti-reggaeton leaders, she gave us the best promotion, because everybody was looking at us and we were going to award shows and she was just clutching her pearls and not what she wanted for Puerto Rico, or to, for Puerto Rico to be known for. Her granddaughter has gone on record to say, she actually loved the music. It was just that she wanted them to be classier about it. Essentially, she didn't want them to talk so nasty about certain things or to use these bad words in their music. So you have that moment of these artists and producers and music video directors having to really struggle to find a way against the government while still either moving in this globalizing path, like, for example, a figure like Daddy Yankee did, or keep critiquing and keep the genre as something that is for the people, that is saying something that is socially meaningful, politically meaningful, or even a combination of both, because that was also very possible and found within the genre. So it's, within that context that we see happening in Puerto Rico in terms of the policing and the whitening and the sanitizing, it's also going on in other places. It's not just Puerto Rico itself. You had similar histories of that in Cuba and the DR, in Mexico, within Latino communities in the United States itself. There was this rise of panic from older generations about this music as it was coming on stronger and stronger through, the radio and the internet and all of this. So there was this there's this constant sort of demonization of the music that then demonizes the people that not only produce it and make it, but also even consume it, which is very unfortunate.
Muévete y perrea, sandunguea, bailotea, búscate a tu gata y yaquea. La noche está fuego en la disco, todo el mundo está bien loco y nadie quiere irse pa' afuera. Perrea, sandunguea.
I want to deviate just a little, based on what you were just saying. You mentioned at the very beginning that you grew up listening to reggaeton. What did your parents think about you listening and dancing to this rhythm?
It's interesting because I feel like my mom has somewhat come around to it being a thing, and it, that I'm interested in, that I write about. She'll sometimes hear some songs. She'll randomly sing Bad Bunny lyrics to me when we converse. And my dad he had a time where he was like, okay, I can get down with this. Like, he used to get pirated CDs with Wisin y Yandel music and all of that. And now he's like, I just don't understand why you're into this. They've gotten so, they're just not saying anything and the rhythm is the same and all of that. So I don't know if it's a thing of him getting older or, just he got tired of it. We're all entitled to. But yeah, it was very interesting, sort of their sort of journeys with that as well. And my grandparents never liked it. My grandparents, they were very much about trio music and boleros and very just, old school type of Puerto Rican, whether it be música jíbara or, just more their speed, some salsa thrown in there just to spice things up. But yeah, I had one of my grandfathers called it reggaeton, because it was just so noisy. It's just a racket. And then my other grandfather hated it. And my cousin had to hide all his tapes when he came over. It's abuelo cannot know about this. So there was this very interesting thing of wanting to protect us as youth within the family, but also these generational differences and the lyrical content being a little bit too mature for where we were in life. And I completely understand that, but it was really just unstoppable. It was everywhere, at our parties in middle school and high school. We were listening to all kinds of music on the playlist, but most of it was reggaeton because that's what we liked. That's what made us groove, what made us dance. And so, yeah, it's been an interesting journey with the genre within my family.
Aguanta, chiquilla, aguanta, que eso me encanta. En la casa con tu mai te pitas la santa. En la calle conmigo eres una sata. Manda, dime quién te manda.
Hey, it's me, Mel, one of the hosts of the Mixtape Podcast. I wanted to take just a few seconds to remind you that in the Mixtape Podcast, we take an anti-racist approach to center the contribution of Black people and culture across the Latin American diaspora through dance and music. Follow us on Instagram at themixedtapepodcast and click the link tree in our bio for more information. And remember, you can find all our episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and through our website, tarheels.live/mixtapepodcast. All right, back to Beth. As we talk about the perceptions and opinions people have about reggaeton, it makes me think about rap in the 80s and the 90s. We know the kind of perceptions that people had about gangsta rap, for example. Would you say that the elements that reggaeton took from rap might have elicited racist and discriminatory beliefs that existed about African Americans in the United States? And that this might be behind the distaste for the rhythm?
Yeah. You have this thing where because there was such similarity between what was being produced with a Black urban American context in Puerto Rico, we got American news. We got, what was going on in New York and what was going on in Florida and Connecticut, even back in the 80s and 90s, not to the extent that we do now, but certainly we did get the news. And there was this always, anti-Blackness within that, a lens of anti-Blackness with which Puerto Ricans gazed upon hip hop. And because reggaeton has a lot of similarities to hip hop, both in sound, in the sartorial choices, in the gendering of people, in the class construction of the genre, that was certainly part of why it was so demonized. It wasn't just the fact that they were poor, they were young, and they were participating in things that weren't very moral sometimes. It was also the fact that a lot of them were Black. And we don't want to, in Puerto Rico, like in much of Latin America and other Caribbean places, it's very much about you're Puerto Rican first. The Tres Raíces, we're all Taino and African and what, and I'm like, I don't know if I'm Taino. I can't go back that far. But there was this understanding and this construction that is very political, very cultural, from the government happening, that mirrored a lot of the nationalist projects in terms of identity that other countries in the region were undergoing as well and constructing, that allowed these elites to not only make themselves against that image, but also to try to police and isolate themselves from that. And so that was part of this history of persecution. And, even to this day, you have artists that are not seen as, politically threatening within the genre, but then there are those that even if they don't sing about politics, because they're politically involved, like a Bad Bunny figure, for example, they are seen as threatening by the state and by the elites. And, they're trying to make it a moral grandstanding type of thing, like, oh, his words are so filthy and he's such a misogynist and this and that. And it's like, okay, but there's also other stuff going on behind your distaste and behind your sometimes hatefulness towards the genre. I can't even front that to this day in 2022, you have, whether it's artists, whether it's, political elites, or just people on Twitter that like, oh, I hate this. This is bad music. This is awful. This is so like classless. And this is so this, and this is so that. And there's always, whether subconsciously or unconsciously, a lot of anti-Black, classist, sexist sort of impetus behind those critiques.
So growing up in Latin America, I often found people that were like, reggaeton, eso no es música, they would say. That's not music. And many of these people were sort of playing the role of gatekeepers of music, saying things like, real music is rock, or even salsa. What's been your experience with this?
Yeah, and I mean, I grew up, again, my parents had and within my family unit, there was all these types of genres being listened to and consumed in our households that I grew up loving and appreciating. And it's always funny to me how, whether it be salsa or rock, because there was this huge like salsa versus rock contention in the 80s, when my dad was growing up and when he was a youth in college and all of that. And he was like, like, I like salsa, but like, I'm really more into rock music. And I think, rock, just like reggaeton and all these other genres, can be used to critique and to release emotion and to really speak about an embodied experience and share that. That's what all music really has in common. But I think that when it comes to rock, whether it be in Spanish or even in English or other languages, and I've thought about this a lot, I think it's because by the time that rock really became like the rock that we know it in our countries, I think it was so distanced from Blackness and its Black origins that they felt okay to attach themselves to it. And then also there was this this anger behind rock that you don't necessarily see within things like salsa and other more folkloric musics within our countries, and reggaeton and hip hop and rap really gave a space for that type of expression too, because there's some songs that are angry, that are really critiquing and going against the government. And then rock music, you have that too. Like you have that sense of anger and wanting to express it and to critique and to talk about something that is bothering you as both an individual and as a larger society. I think there's more similarities there than maybe both camps are sort of recognizing at the moment, or historically. But I think that there's that reggaeton, even within its whitening, it's still so, you can hear the Blackness of it. Like with rock, it's been touched so much and transformed so much that it just feels like something new and something that is above race and beyond class. And, I wouldn't say gender, because that's still a thing that within rock music and many musical genres is still an issue. But it wasn't a thing of, only these type of people necessarily, can go within and feel anger and express anger. There's a music for everybody to express anger. And there were sort of racial affinities within that, because we do still see rock as a mostly white genre, even with its Black origins. And we see still reggaeton as a Black thing, even with, a white, very white presenting person like Rosalia, who is from Spain, and, other types of artists that have come in and taken, not necessarily the mantle, I wouldn't say, but they've taken a space within the genre and made it their own and have found success that way.
About the expansion of reggaeton in the US. Tell us a little about the expansion throughout Latin America, specifically as it relates to dembow in the Dominican Republic and reparto in Cuba.
I think it's very interesting because when we live in, those of us that live in the Caribbean or even in Latin America, we don't get to be taught too much about each other. Like, I grew up and was raised in Puerto Rico until I was 17, 18 and went off to college. And I hardly knew anything about the Dominican Republic in terms of its history, its politics, Cuba. Like we knew about Fidel and we knew about the revolution, but it wasn't a thing of like, we didn't know all the elements of it. We didn't know about Jamaica and what happened there. We didn't know about Trinidad and Tobago. Like, even though we're this, region of islands that are pretty close to each other, we weren't necessarily learning about each other. And I think that what I find very interesting and beautiful about music, and reggaeton in particular, is how it has traveled through the Caribbean and allowed us to know a bit more about each other, whether it be about our, quotidian life in San Juan, or in Panama, or in La Habana, or wherever it may be. That has sort of been an entry point for a lot of us to get to know about each other. And so the fact that, it has to be said that in terms of, Dominicans, they've always been within the genre. A lot of our, major artists that are considered or read as Puerto Rican because they came up from the Puerto Rican scene are actually half Dominican, or Dominican, but raised between New York and Puerto Rico, for example. So here I'm thinking about Nicky Jam and Arcángel and the Looney Tunes, the producer duo, they are Dominican. They were living in the East Coast, heard these beats, was like, oh, like there's like reggae and español and dancehall, and this is great, and we're gonna get into it. And now, you know, we have this very pan-Caribbean sort of building of reggaeton, and it was always built within it. In terms of how it looks like today and the involvement of Dominicans today and Cubans today, you know, the spread of reggaeton to Cuba was slower because of the internet being so censored in Cuba and all of that, but it still went to Cuba and it still arrived in Cuba, which is incredible. And they sort of took that same spirit that really powered Puerto Rican youth in the 80s and 90s to speak out against governments and express lived realities. They took that and they ran with it, and they went and talked about what it is to live in the 2010s in Cuba under Fidel and that type of government and that type of limitation and the way that they want to resist and the Cuba that they want to see. And it was banned back in the early 2010s in Cuba because of this, very similar to how it used to be in Puerto Rico in the 90s and 2000s. And, you know, it wasn't necessarily banned, but it was very much like policed and censured and, you know, attacked in so many ways, as I discussed earlier. And then in the Dominican Republic, like they ran with the dembow beat and just went to town on it and created something of their own, something that was very particular of theirs. And it's very interesting when you sit down and listen to contemporary or maybe like 2010s type reggaeton from all three islands. You know, we're the Hispanic Caribbean, but politically and historically, we're very different in many ways. We have similarities, but, you know, we have Cuba, who is still under this very particular form of government. And we have the Dominican Republic that is independent, but still has a lot of extraction and, you know, exploitation be part of its political and economic system. And then we have, of course, Puerto Rico, who is still technically a colony of the United States. So those very three particular government systems create particular daily lives for Cubans, Dominicans, and Puerto Ricans. And you can hear that in all three different types of reggaeton that have been created there.
Thinking about the musical output coming out of the three islands, the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and Cuba, it almost seems as though the music that comes out of Cuba is a bit more political, would you say? I mean, perhaps this is the case because it has to be more political given the environment there, maybe?
I wouldn't necessarily say, you know, in Puerto Rico back in 2019, you know, the people marched and protested for like 15, 16 days in the summer and ousted our governor, first governor that the people have ousted in Puerto Rico through protest, which was historic. And the night that the governor resigned, there had been this planned, convened, yet somehow still very organic perreo combativo in front of the oldest Catholic church in San Juan. And, you know, the people were using the music that did not necessarily have revolutionary lyrics or anything like that, but they were not only trying to discomfort the government as they went up to La Fortaleza, which is the governor's mansion, they were also trying to discomfort coloniality, and they were trying to discomfort the respectability that comes with these legacies of Catholicism and more so evangelicalism in Puerto Rico and their influence upon our government, how we are run as a society, the rights that we have and don't have. So a lot of the participants in that event were young, they were queer, they were Black, they were disabled, sometimes all of that together. And they really made this very ephemeral event forever change that geography, because, you know, now when you talk about this, you know, this event of protest, this summer of protest, within a lot of Puerto Rican scholars and people in general, they're like, oh, el perreo combativo, like that was fun, that was this. Or people, because they don't like reggaeton, are like, that was awful, like so disrespectful to the Catholic Church and all. So you still have those reactions, and it's still a point of conversation. And I don't want to say that reggaeton was the thing that ousted the governor, but I think it certainly helped in many ways. That was sort of like the death knell. I was like, okay, I have to get out of here.
No, I mean, that's a great point, because yeah, in reality, of course, I mean, part of, you know, a musician has to be a musician before they're politicians, right? Nobody's going to be like trova cubana all the time. Yeah. So I think that's that point about how music doesn't necessarily have to have on its lyrics the politics to be a political instrument is it's one, and if anything, it's part of why I've been kind of starting to love more and more reggaeton and dembow and reparto and all these rhythms that are so brash. Mm-hmm. It's because of their brashness. It's like, yes, we're gonna make you uncomfortable. We're gonna talk about, you know, all these ideas of morality, all these veiled truths that we have accepted. We're gonna unroot them just because we want to and because we can. And I think that's a liberating. You know, we don't have to be so constrained about our morals for no reason, right? Well, for our history of colonialism, I should say.
I mean, that's not to say that even within reggaeton, it's, you know, because there's still a lot of misogyny within reggaeton. There's a lot of gatekeeping of queer artists and women who want to take up the mic and become stars within the genre. And so I think in the time that we live in, it's easier for them to find an audience, because there is an audience that is thirsty for that, to find the queer reggaeton artists to, like, you know, stand down and support and love, or the woman rapera who's like can really, you know, spit really sick flows and be like, I'm about something and I love that and I'm going to support her. There's a space for that and there's a hunger for that. And I think there's a lot of artists that are, you know, meeting that requirement, but of course they're not household names like Bad Bunny and Daddy Yankee and Wisin y Yandel, and even on the Colombian side, Karol G and Maluma and J Balvin. So there's a lot of still, once again, gatekeeping in terms of not only race and who gets to represent this genre and perform it, but also which women get in there and what they do within the genre. Because if you notice, a lot of the like hot reggaetoneras, you know, and when I say hot, I mean like popular, they're singing, they're not rapping necessarily, if at all. So there's still a sort of gendered look into who can rap within reggaeton, who can represent within reggaeton when it comes to gender and race, but also in terms of sexuality, because reggaeton, a lot of it has devolved into a very sexualized fantasy. They're selling us something. They're selling us a fantasy, a type of encounter sometimes within a song that we can gravitate towards. And it's not necessarily reality, but it's doing something, and it's doing something interesting, but yet we still have to look into how it can be very limiting to who is the one that can participate in this fantasy and who is the one that can consume this fantasy with me as a, you know, cis straight man on the mic selling this to other people.
Beth, are you aware of artists who consciously elevate the Black roots and contributions of the rhythm and intentionally make space for Black people in a now white-dominated rhythm?
I think, I mean, because you can do that as an artist in many different ways. You can do that with who produces your beats, with who you feature on your tracks, You can do that in who you feature in your music videos. If you're featuring more Black people that are, you know, still going to these clubs and enjoying this music, just because we might not necessarily be in the music videos because of colorism and racism, doesn't mean that we're not dancing to this music and that we're not enjoying it and still full participants of this genre. And you can also just give your flowers to artists and really recognize the roots of this. You know, you can really instruct yourself in the history of this genre that you love so much. Like, every time I think about J Balvin and him thinking that he couldn't do reggaeton because
Oh my God, don't.
there was nobody, like everybody was Black, and it wasn't until Daddy Yankee came along that he felt like he was comfortable to be there. I'm like, surprise, Daddy Yankee's dad is actually Black, and he comes from a very well-respected bomba family in Puerto Rico. So, you know, just because he also had, you know, to machinate his look to be more white and palatable to these global audiences. Like, Daddy Yankee has had the same haircut for 25 years. If he lets it grow out, you will know where he comes from. Like, this was all very tactical when it comes to Daddy Yankee. So for someone to not know that, to not enmesh themselves or recognize such a thing within the genre, because it's always been very multiracial in a way. Like, I'm not saying that these poor Puerto Ricans from the 80s and 90s were all Black. They weren't. There were mestizos and mulattos and whiter people too, because there's poor white people everywhere. So they were all coming together and creating this scene from the same class standpoint, and depending on who was doing it, the gender standpoint and the sort of desire for survival and success and sexuality and all of these things that drove these young guys back in the 80s and 90s to create the genre and really push it to be something bigger. And so I think that back then it was very, in many ways, organic in how they all mixed and worked together and, you know, really respected each other. And then once you got into like selling beef to sell records and like creating these like rumors of discomfort and unhappiness and riffs and inviting other people from other countries and then signing major record deals, and that sort of really helped the genre be so divorced from that ease and that like recognition of itself being Black from the artists and from the producers. Because to this day, it's like, I really wish I could talk to all of these people, mostly these men, because it's still a whole lot of men within reggaeton, and tell them like, you're gatekeeping a lot of great talent just because of these imposed ideas of who is desirable in terms of race, who is desirable in terms of even now national origin, as more people from other countries come into the genre, their sexuality, their gender. Like, there's so much that is being elided and basically driven away from this mainstream scene because of this. And I think that that's why, you know, they're so set in their ways now that it's so hard to find that recognition and that sort of just desire to be like, hey, yeah, we have Black roots and we're gonna respect Black artists and we're gonna bring them back on the map. Like, it's happening to a certain extent, but not to the point where I'm like, I feel comfortable with that. I feel like I felt back in like 2001 or 2002, being a kid, watching music videos where I could see people of all colors, including my own and darker, being out there and being fabulous and doing all of these things and showing their talent that is being made really hard by these metrics of desirability and what can be sold and who will be more successful the easiest, because it's become so capital driven and capitalistic. Not that it wasn't before, because these guys were hustling and selling their tapes out of their cars and all of that back in the 80s and 90s, but it's become so much larger than what they were prepared for and what they envisioned, that now this is what we have, like a whitening and a sort of hard stance against, it's like, hey, let's bring it back. Like, just because you go and film your music video in Jamaica, that doesn't tell me that you respect the Black roots of this genre. You're just using Jamaica as a backdrop. So there's still a lot of work to do within that and that particular issue within the genre.
Beth, thank you so much for taking time to meet with us and share your personal and professional knowledge and enthusiasm about this rhythm. We enjoyed a lot hearing from you. If you want to hear more from Beth, check out our latest Where You Listening episode, where Beth works with me to contextualize Tego Calderón's impactful song, Loíza.
I would also like to extend a thank you to Beth, who is absolutely amazing to learn from. Stick around, because this is not the last time you'll be hearing from her on our platform. Thank you for listening. This is Mixtape.
Y te juro que sin batería soy el más que duro. Toditos a la vez son uno a uno. Ellos son muchos nudillos y un solo nudo. Búscate todos los alicates que sean necesarios. Ellos tienen un idioma, yo tengo varios. Se siente mi flow por donde paso con un micrófono y 12 manos en el mismo brazo.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Facebook, where you can find us at mixedtape.podcast. And also on Twitter and YouTube, which you can find on our website, tarheels.live/mixtapepodcast. Make sure you click the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Do you have any suggestions, questions, or comments? Email us at themixedtapepodcast@gmail.com. Remember that you can also send us audio clips with your reflections for future episodes. Thanks for listening. This is Mixtape.